Nobody in the galaxy had ever said no. That was the thing about the rulers. Council, for over 1,000 years they had governed known space with a simple system. New species were discovered, contacted, and given a choice: join the galactic, conquered under the Council's authority, or be left alone in the cold dark of unprotected space where pirates, warlords, and starvation would do the Council's work for them. Every species eventually chose to join. And joining meant bending. It meant handing over control of your military. It meant opening your borders. To Council inspectors, it meant accepting that your world, your people, your future, all of it belonged to they conquered first and to you second. Nobody had ever refused, not for long. Anyway, so when the formal transmission from Earth arrived at the Council's orbital station Ethira Prime, the 5 rulers, who sat in the great circular chamber, expected nothing unusual. Grand Sovereign Allah of the Dithrani Hegemony read the message aloud, his deep voice echoing off the polished walls. The message was short, it was polite, and it broke something in the room that could never be repaired. Earth respectfully declined. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of rulers who suddenly realized they were standing on ice and it had just cracked beneath them. Arkan Sivder of the Palori Dominion was the first to speak. She leaned forward. In her seat, her silver-scaled face tight with anger, she said what everyone was thinking. If humans were allowed to refuse, others would follow. The Marathi, the Chelan, the dozens of smaller species who had always resented the Council's grip. One crack in the wall and the whole thing would come down. Speaker Jelan of the Marathi Collective raised a hand. He was the calmest voice in the chamber and urged caution. He reminded the Council that humans were not like the other species they had absorbed. Humans came from a death world, a planet with crushing gravity, extreme weather, predators in every biome, and oceans that could swallow entire continents. Their biology was built for punishment. Their history was built on war. Pushing them might not go the way the Council expected. Alath listened to both arguments and made his decision. He ordered a formal ultimatum to be drafted and sent to Earth. Submit within 30 standard cycles or face the full weight of the conquered's military. He believed, as he had always believed, that strength was the only language the galaxy understood. The ultimatum was transmitted on every open channel. Every species in the conquered saw it, every world, every colony, every ship. The message was clear: bend or break. On Earth, Admiral Revel Conquo received the transmission in her office at the United Earth Defense Command. She read it once, set it down, and called Delegate Amir Halabi, Earth's representative to the conquered. Halabi had been stationed on Ethira Prime for 3 years, navigating the endless politics of the Council. He knew how the game was played. He also knew that this time the game had changed. Akinquo asked him one question: was there any room to negotiate? Halabi thought for a long moment. He had seen how the Council treated species that tried to bargain from a position of weakness. The Chelan had tried it 60 years ago. They lost their fleet, their trade routes, and 2 colony worlds before they finally submitted. Negotiation only worked if the other side believed you were willing to walk away from the table, and walking away from the Council meant war. He told her the truth. The Council did not negotiate with species they considered beneath them, and right now, they considered humanity beneath them. Okonkwo nodded. She had expected that answer. She gave Halabi his instructions. Return to Ethera Prime, stand before the Council and deliver Earth's response in person, make it clear, make it calm, and make it final. Halabi asked what the response would be. Okonkwo looked at him and said 3 words: we do not kneel. Halabi closed the transmission and sat alone in his quarters for a long time. He understood what those words meant. Not just for Earth, but for the galaxy. The Council had maintained order for 1,000 years through the simple belief that resistance was pointless, that belief was about to be tested. On Ethera Prime, the Council moved quickly. Warden Barak, the military commander of the Concords combined fleet, was summoned to the chamber. He was a Palori like Sitha, tall, armored in natural bone plates, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He had crushed rebellions before. He had burned colonies that refused to pay tribute. He looked at the map of the Sol system and saw nothing that concerned him. One small species, one small fleet, one lesson to be taught. Jelen watched Borax confidence and felt something he had not felt in a very long time: doubt, not in the Council's power that was beyond question, but in its wisdom. He had studied humanity more than any other Council member. He had read their history, their literature, their philosophy. He knew something about humans that Barak and Sitha and Ulath did not. Humans did not fight harder when they were winning. They fought harder when they were losing. They were the only species in the known galaxy whose survival instinct did not tell them to run, it told them to stand. And that Jelen thought as he watched Barak plan his war was what made them the most dangerous species the Council had ever faced. Across the galaxy, every eye turned toward Earth. The countdown had begun. The chamber had not been this full in over 200 years. Representatives from 46 species filled the observation galleries above the Council floor. They had come from every corner of the Concord: traders, diplomats, soldiers, scholars, all of them here for the same reason. All of them waiting to see what the humans would do. Delegate Amir Halabi walked into the chamber alone. He wore no armor, carried no weapons, and brought no guards. Just a man in a dark suit walking across a floor designed to make visitors feel small. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet above him, lined with the banners of every species that had submitted to the Council. There was an empty space at the end of the row where Earth's banner was supposed to hang. Halabi looked at that empty space and kept walking. Grand Sovereign Uleth sat at the center of the Council's curved table. Archon Sitha was to his left, her silver scales catching the light. Speaker Jelen sat to the right, his 4 eyes watching Halabi with an expression that was difficult to read. Warden Barak stood behind them in full military dress, arms folded across his bone-plated chest. Uleth spoke first. He reminded Halabi that the ultimatum had been sent with clear terms: 30 cycles, full military surrender, open borders, integration into the Concord's command structure. He asked formally and for the record whether Earth had reconsidered. Halabi stepped forward and answered. He spoke calmly, without raising his voice. He said that Earth had received the ultimatum and understood its terms. He said that humanity valued peace and had no desire for conflict with the conquered, or any of its member species. He said that Earth was willing to engage in trade, cultural exchange, scientific cooperation, and mutual defense agreements. But Earth would not surrender its military, Earth would not open its borders to foreign inspectors, and Earth would not accept any agreement that placed another species' authority above its own. He paused and looked around the chamber, not at the council, but at the galleries above, at the dozens of species watching. Peace is built between equals, he said, not between masters and servants. The chamber erupted. Sithai slammed her hand on the table and called the statement an insult. She pointed at Halabi and listed the species that had resisted before: the Chelan, the Vorathi, the Duran. She described what had happened to each of them: economic blockades, trade route closures, and for the Vorathi, who had held out the longest, orbital strikes on their colony worlds until they finally broke. She looked directly at Halabi and asked if humans wanted to be the next example. Halabi did not look away. He said that Earth had studied every one of those cases, every blockade, every strike, every forced surrender. He said that humanity had learned from each one, and then he said something that made the chamber go quiet. You taught us exactly what to prepare for, and we prepared. Jelen leaned forward. For the first time he spoke directly to the human delegate. He asked what Halabi meant by that, not as a threat, but as a genuine question. What had the humans prepared? Halabi looked at him and gave a small, respectful nod. He said that he could not share military details in an open chamber, but he could share something more important. He said that humanity had not prepared to anyone. They had prepared to survive, to hold their ground, protect their people, and endure whatever came, because that was what humans had always done. Aluth raised a hand to silence the murmuring in the galleries. He told Halabi that endurance was not the same as victory, that the council had resources, ships, and soldiers beyond anything Earth could match. He said this not as a threat, but as a fact. Halabi agreed. He said that the council's fleet was larger, its resources deeper, and its reach wider than anything humanity could challenge directly. But he reminded the council of something else. Wars were not won by the side with the most ships. Wars were won by the side that was willing to pay the highest price. And humans, he said quietly, had been paying high prices since before they left their home world. The session ended without resolution. Aluth dismissed the chamber, and the representatives filed out in stunned silence. Nothing like this had happened in living memory. A species with a fraction of the council's power had stood in their chamber and refused to blink. After the session, Halabi walked through the station's lower corridors toward his quarters. A voice called to him from a side passage. He turned and found Envoy Relai, a junior Marathi diplomat, standing in the shadows. Relai was small even by Marathi standards, with pale blue skin and nervous hands. He told Halabi that he needed to know something. Warden Barak was not waiting for the ultimatum to expire. He had already begun assembling a fleet. 400 warships drawn from every conquered species. They were gathering at the Palori staging grounds, and they would be ready to move within 15 cycles. The council was not bluffing. They were going to war whether the 30 cycles expired or not. Halabi thanked the envoy and asked why he was sharing this. Rulai looked at the floor and said that not everyone in the conquered believed. The council was right, some of them were tired of watching species get crushed. For wanting to be free, he did not say anything else. He turned and disappeared back into the corridor. Halabi returned to his quarters and opened an encrypted channel to Admiral Akonkwo. He kept the message brief. They are coming 15 cycles, 400 ships. Prepare everything. On Earth, Akonkwo read the message, closed the channel and began making calls. The time for talking was over. Somewhere between Jupiter and Saturn, a line was drawn in the dark. It was not a physical line. There were no walls, no fences, no markers floating in the emptiness of space, but every officer in the United Earth Defense Fleet knew exactly where it was. It ran along the outer edge of the Sol system, curving through the asteroid belt and stretching past the gas giants. Everything inside that line was home, and home was not for sale. Captain Priya Sandoval sat in the command chair of the warship Defiance, watching the tactical display that filled the main screen. Her ship was one of 87 in Earth's active fleet, a number that sounded impressive until you compared it to the 400 warships heading their way. She had been a soldier for 22 years. She had fought pirates near the Kuiper Belt, chased smugglers through the rings of Saturn, and once faced down a rogue Chelan destroyer that had wandered into human space by accident. None of those experiences had prepared her for what was coming. Lieutenant Don Ferrara, her tactical officer, pulled up the latest sensor data. The Council fleet had departed the Palori staging ground 6 cycles ago. They were moving in standard formation, a massive central column of heavy warships flanked by screening frigates and supply ships. At their current speed, they would reach Sol's outer boundary in 9 cycles. Ferraro ran the numbers. He ran them twice, then a third time, hoping the math would change. It did not. The Council fleet outnumbered them roughly 3-1 in warships alone, and nearly 5-1 if you counted support vessels in a straight fight. Open space, fleet against fleet, Earth would lose. But Ferraro had noticed something else. The Council fleet was not a single navy. It was a coalition. Dithrani ships used one communication system. Palori ships used another. The Marathi vessels had their own command protocols, and the smaller allied species each brought their own methods. In peacetime, this did not matter. In the chaos of battle, it would matter enormously. He brought this to Sandoval, who brought it to Admiral Akonkwo. Akonkwo listened carefully. She was aboard her flagship, the carrier Resolve, positioned near the asteroid belt with the main body of the fleet. She had spent the last 10 cycles preparing for this moment, and preparation was something humans understood better than most species realized. Earth's fleet was smaller, but it was unified. Every ship used the same systems, the same language, the same command structure. When Akonkwo gave an order, it reached every vessel in her fleet within seconds. The Council fleet would need minutes to coordinate the same action across its different species. In battle, minutes were lifetimes, but numbers still mattered. So Akonkwo had added something to the equation that the Council did not know about. For the past 30 years, Earth had been quietly building not just ships, but infrastructure, weapons platforms hidden Inside asteroids, sensor arrays buried. In the surfaces of moons, communication. Relays disguised as space debris. The Sol system itself had been turned into a fortress, and the Council's intelligence network had missed almost all of it because they had never taken humans seriously enough to look closely. Okonkwo addressed the fleet on a secure channel. She did not give a roaring speech or pound her fist on the table. She spoke the way she always spoke, directly, honestly, and without decoration. She told them that the Council fleet was coming. She told them the numbers were bad. She told them that the galaxy expected humanity to fold just like every other species had folded before them. And then she told them the only thing that mattered. We are not every other species. We hold the line we do not break. Across the fleet, her words settled into the bones of every officer and crew member. There was no cheering, no dramatic moment, just the quiet click of weapon systems being armed and navigation computers locking in defensive positions. On Ethera Prime, the Council was not idle. Grand Sovereign Uleth sat in his private chamber reviewing the fleet's progress reports. Everything was on schedule. Warden Barak had assured him that the operation would be swift, a show of overwhelming force that would end human resistance before it truly began. Uleth wanted to believe him, but Speaker Jelen had requested a private audience, and Uleth could not refuse without looking weak. Jelen entered the chamber and spoke plainly. He told Uleth that this war was a mistake, not because the Council would lose. He did not believe they would, but because winning would cost more than Uleth understood. He said that humans were not like the Chelun or the Varathi. Those species had resisted out of pride, and pride could be broken. Humans resisted out of something deeper, something that did not have a clean translation in any conquered language. The closest word was stubbornness, but that was not quite right. It was more like a fundamental refusal to accept that their fate could be decided by anyone other than themselves. Aloth listened and then dismissed him. He said that the Council had faced stubborn species before and won. Jelen left without another word, but as he walked the corridors back to his quarters, he could not shake the feeling that the galaxy was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Far away in the cold silence beyond Neptune, the first Council scouts dropped out of faster-than-light travel and began scanning the Sol system. Their sensors picked up the human fleet arranged in tight defensive clusters between the asteroids and the moons of Jupiter. Warden Barak received the scout reports and smiled. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and hiding behind rocks. This would be over quickly. He was wrong. The first explosion lit up the darkness near the asteroid belt like a second sun. A Palori destroyer had jumped ahead of the main fleet, eager to draw first blood. It locked onto a small human patrol group, 3 frigates running a sensor sweep near a cluster of tumbling rocks. The destroyer opened fire with plasma cannons that could melt through hull plating like water through paper. The shots tore across the void, bright and fast and deadly. They hit nothing. The human frigates had already moved. They scattered the instant their sensors detected the incoming ship, sliding behind asteroids with a precision that spoke of endless drilling and preparation. The destroyer tried to track them, swinging its cannons left and right, but The frigates were faster, and they knew this terrain. They had trained here, they had mapped every rock, every gap, every shadow in this belt. Before the destroyer could fire again, two of the frigates circled behind it and fired their kinetic rail guns into its engine block. The shots punched through the armor like needles through cloth. The destroyer drifted, engines dead, leaking atmosphere from a dozen holes. The Battle of Saul had begun. Warden Boric received word of the lost destroyer and felt a flash of irritation, but nothing more. One ship meant nothing. He gave the order, and the full council fleet surged forward, 400 warships, arranged in a wide crescent formation, designed to envelop the defenders and crush them from every angle. Admiral Akonkwa watched them come. She sat in her command chair aboard the Resolve, her face calm, her hands steady on the armrests. The tactical display showed the incoming fleet as a wave of red markers spreading across the outer system like a slow tide. Behind them, her own fleet was a thin line of blue tucked between asteroids and clustered near the moons of Jupiter. She waited. She let them come deeper into the system, past the outer boundary, past the Kuiper belt, into the asteroid field itself. And then she gave the order. Across the belt, hidden weapons platforms came alive. They had been built into the asteroids over the past 20 years. Railgun batteries, missile launchers, and electronic warfare stations, all buried beneath layers of rock and disguised to look like natural formations. They opened fire simultaneously, hitting the flanks of the Council fleet from positions that the enemy's sensors had never detected. The effect was immediate and devastating. The crescent formation, designed for open space combat, was suddenly taking fire from inside its own lines. Explosions rippled along the left flank as Dethroni cruisers took hits they never saw coming. On the right, a cluster of smaller Allied vessels broke formation entirely, scattering in panic as missiles streaked out of the darkness. Boric roared orders, trying to reorganize his fleet, but here was the problem that Lieutenant Ferreira had predicted. The Dethroni ships received his orders one format, the Palori ships received them in another. The Maradi vessels had their own chain of command, and the smaller species ships were waiting for instructions from captains who were themselves waiting for instructions from someone else. The Council fleet did not fall apart, but it stumbled. Captain Sandoval saw the opening. She led a fast attack squadron of 12 ships through a gap in the crescent and drove straight for the communication relay ships, the vessels that held the coalition together. Her squadron hit them hard and fast, destroying 4 relay ships in the first pass. Without those relays, the different fleets within the coalition lost their ability to coordinate in real time. Now the confusion became chaos. Dethroni ships began issuing their own orders, contradicting the commands coming from Boric's flagship. Palori captains refused to follow Dethroni directions. A group of Chelan frigates, forced into the coalition against their will, simply stopped firing and drifted to the edge of the battle. Boric tried to hold it together. He was a good commander, experienced and tough, and he managed to pull his core Palori warships into a tight formation that punched through the asteroid belt toward the human fleet's main body. The fighting there was brutal. Human ships took hits. The carrier Fortitude lost its port flight deck to a plasma Barrage, 2 destroyers were cut in half by concentrated fire from Palori. Battle cruisers. But the human fleet did not break. Every ship that took damage fell back behind the next line of defense. Every gap in the formation was filled by another ship. Moving up, the fleet fought like a single organism, one mind, one purpose, one unbreakable will. 6 hours, that was how long the battle lasted. 6 hours of fire and silence, of ships dying in flashes of light, of crews fighting in the dark between the rocks. At the end of those 6 hours, Boric looked at his losses and made a decision he had never imagined making. He ordered a retreat. The Council fleet pulled back beyond the outer boundary of the Sol system, leaving behind nearly 100 destroyed or crippled ships. The humans had lost 32 vessels of their own. Heavy price for a fleet their size, but they were still there, still holding the line. On Ethera Prime, the Council watched the battle feeds in their chamber. The room was silent. This was supposed to have been a demonstration, a quick crushing display of power that would remind the galaxy who was in charge. Instead, it had become the first military defeat the Council had suffered in over 300 years. Sifda stared at the screen, her silver scales pale with fury. Jelen sat motionless, his 4 eyes fixed on the image of the human fleet reforming. Behind the asteroids, Uleth said nothing at all. Aboard the Resolve, Akonquа reviewed the damage reports. Her fleet was battered. Many ships needed repairs that would take cycles to complete, but they were alive and they were still between the Council and Earth. She opened a channel to the fleet. Her voice was tired but steady. They will come again, and we will be here when they do. The news traveled faster than any warship could. Within hours of the battle, recordings of the fight at Sol were being shared on communication networks across the conquered. Traders passed them to merchants, merchants passed them to dock workers whispered about them in cargo bays and engine rooms on 100 different worlds. The recordings were grainy, pulled from long-range sensor feeds in civilian ships that had been watching from a safe distance, but the images were clear enough. The Council fleet, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, had been forced to retreat by a species that most of the conquered still considered primitives. On the Chellan homeworld, where the memory of their own forced surrender still burned like an open wound, crowds gathered in public squares to watch the footage. Nobody said anything dangerous. Nobody called for rebellion, but silence itself was a kind of rebellion, because in that silence was a question that the Council had spent 1,000 years making sure nobody ever asked. What if we had fought back? On Ethera Prime, Warden Boric stormed into the Council chamber demanding reinforcements. His fleet had pulled back to staging point beyond the Sol system's edge, and he needed fresh ships to replace his losses. He was not defeated, he insisted. The humans had gotten lucky. Their hidden weapons had been a surprise, but now he knew where they were. A second assault with a larger force would finish the job. Archon Sitha supported him immediately. She argued that every cycle they waited was a cycle that the humans used to repair their ships and strengthen their defenses. More importantly, it was a cycle that other species used to watch and wonder if resistance was possible. She warned the Council that if they did not crush the humans quickly and Completely, the conquered would begin to unravel. Then Speaker Jelen stood and the chamber went quiet. Jelen had been a member of the council. For 40 years, he had never raised his voice, he had never publicly opposed a council decision. He was known as the reasonable one, the mediator, the voice that smoothed over disagreements and kept the peace. So when he spoke, everyone listened. He said that the Marathi collective would not send additional ships. The words landed like a bomb in the center of the room. Scytha spun toward him, her scales flashing with anger. Uleth's ancient eyes narrowed. Borak clenched his fist so hard that his bone plates cracked. Jelen continued calmly. He said that the humans had proven something that the council could not afford to ignore. They would rather die than submit. Destroying them was possible. He did not dispute the council's military superiority, but destroying a species that chose death over surrender would not demonstrate strength, it would demonstrate cruelty. And cruelty, he said, was the fastest way to turn quiet resentment into open revolt. Scytha called him a coward. Jelen looked at her without blinking and said that courage was not the same as wisdom, and the council had been mistaking one for the other for a very long time. Uleth silenced both of them. He told Jelen that the Marathi were bound by treaty to support council military operations. Jelen nodded and said that was true. He also said that the Marathi collective's parliament had voted that morning to invoke the defensive clause. Their treaty obligations only required military support for defensive wars, and an invasion of a species that had never attacked the conquered did not qualify. It was a legal argument thin as paper, but it was enough to delay things, and everyone in the room knew it. The cracks spread quickly after that. Within 3 cycles, the Chelun quietly withdrew their remaining ships from Borak's fleet, citing maintenance issues that everyone knew were fabricated. 2 smaller species did the same. The council's coalition, which had seemed so overwhelming just days ago, was shrinking. And then something happened that changed everything. On Earth, Delegate Halabi proposed a move that Admiral Akinquo called either brilliant or insane. He wanted to send a message, not to the council but to the citizens of every conquered world. A direct broadcast on every open frequency, bypassing the council entirely and speaking to the people they claimed to represent. Akinquo approved it. She understood what Halabi understood. This war was not going to be won by ships alone. It was going to be won by ideas. Halabi's message was broadcast from Earth's deep space communication array. It reached every corner of the conquered. Within hours, he spoke simply and directly. He said that Earth did not want war with anyone. He said that humans had no desire to conquer, dominate, or control any other species. All they wanted was the right to govern themselves. And then he said the part that mattered most. He said that every species in the conquered deserved the same right. He offered friendship, trade, and cooperation to any world that was willing to treat humanity as an equal, not as a master, not as a subject, in equal. The message was not a weapon, it was a seed, and it landed on fertile ground across a galaxy that had been living under the council's shadow for far too long. Borak, still waiting for reinforcements that were not coming, watched the broadcast from his flagship. He understood, perhaps for the first time, That he was not fighting a fleet, he was fighting an idea, and ideas could not be killed with plasma cannons. Back on Ethera Prime, Grand Sovereign, Uleth sat alone in his chamber. The galaxy map glowed on the wall. Front of him, thousands of worlds, hundreds of species, all connected by the threads of council authority. He had spent his entire life maintaining those threads. Now, for the first time, he could see them fraying. The humans had not just refused to bend. They had shown the entire galaxy that bending was always a choice. And choices once seen could not be unseen. Borak's fleet came back to Sol expecting to finish what it started. What it found, instead, was something that no council war plan had ever accounted for. The human fleet was still there, battered but reformed, holding its line between the asteroids and the moons of Jupiter. But it was no longer alone. Sitting alongside the human warships, weapons armed and shields raised, was a flotilla of 20 Maradi cruisers. Their green hulls stood out against the gray and white of the human vessels like bright leaves on a winter branch. Speaker Jelen had made his choice, and he had made it public. His transmission reached Borak's flagship moments after the Maradis. Ships appeared on sensors. Jelen's voice was calm, the way it always was, but his words carried the weight of a decision that could not be taken back. Turn your fleet around, Warden, or fight on us too. But know this: the galaxy is watching, and it will remember what you do next. Borak stood on his bridge and stared at the tactical display. The Maradis were a council species. Firing on them would not be war, it would be civil war. It would shatter the conquered in a way that no outside threat ever could. He opened a channel to Ethera Prime. Sitha's voice came through immediately. Sharp and furious, she ordered him to attack. She said the Maradi had committed treason and deserved what they got. She said that hesitation now would destroy everything the council had built. But Borak was not listening to Sitha. He was watching his fleet, the Dathroni captains, old soldiers who had served the council for decades, were already pulling their ships back from the forward line. One by one, their weapons went dark. They would not fire on the Marachi, not today, not over this. The smaller allied ships followed. Chelan frigates powered down their guns. A group of Durin corvettes turned their engines away from the battlefield. The coalition that Borak had held together through force of will was dissolving in front of his eyes. Only the Palori ships remained in attack formation, Sitha's own people loyal to their Archon to the last. But even with every Palori warship in the fleet, they were now outnumbered by the combined human and Marachi force. The math had changed, and Borak was smart enough to read it. He closed the channel to Sitha without a word. Then he gave the order that ended the war. Full retreat, all ships effective. Immediately, the council fleet turned and left the Sol system for the last time. No shots were fired, no ships were lost. The battle was won by a choice, not a weapon. On Ethera Prime, the emergency council session was the most chaotic in the station's history. Sitha stood at the center of the chamber, screaming that the Marachi had betrayed the Concord and demanding immediate sanctions. Jelen sat in his chair with his four eyes closed, letting her fury wash over him like wind over stone. Aloth watched them both and said nothing. For a long time, the galleries above were packed again, just as they had been when Halabi delivered Earth's refusal. But the mood was different now. The representatives in those galleries were not watching with curiosity, they were watching with hope. Finally, Aluth raised his hand. Chamber fell silent. He looked old in that moment, older than he had ever appeared. The weight of 1,000 years of council authority sat on his shoulders, and he could feel it crumbling. He announced that the ultimatum against Earth was withdrawn effective immediately. All military operations in and around the Sol system were terminated. He said that the council would open formal negotiations with humanity on the terms of a new relationship, not integration, but partnership. Scytha slammed her fist on the table and stormed out of the chamber. She declared that the Palori Dominion would remember this betrayal, but her threats echoed off empty walls. Without the Council's combined fleet, the Palori alone could not challenge anyone, and everyone in the room knew it. Delegate Halabi was given the floor. He stood in the same spot where he had delivered Earth's refusal weeks earlier. The empty space on the wall where Earth's banner was supposed to hang was still empty. It would remain empty. Earth would not hang its banner among the banners of species that had bent the knee, but perhaps Halabi thought it was time to build a new wall. He spoke briefly. He did not gloat. He did not list the Council's failures or remind them of the battle they had lost. Instead, he extended an open hand. He proposed a reformed Concord, not a hierarchy with the Council at the top, but a genuine alliance of equals, free trade between any willing worlds, mutual defense, agreements that were voluntary, not forced, a seat at the table for every species, regardless of size or power. We did not fight to be above anyone. He said, we fought to stand beside you. Jelen was the first to accept. He stood across the chamber and clasped Halabi's hand in a gesture of agreement that had not been used in the Concord for centuries, a gesture between equals. Others followed the Jelen representative, the Duran, one by one, like a dam breaking. Aboard the Resolve, Admiral Akonkwa watched the feeds from the Council chamber. Lieutenant Ferreira stood beside her, arms folded, a tired smile on his face. He asked her if she thought the peace would hold. Akonkwa looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, the same stars that humans had looked at for thousands of years, dreaming of the day they would walk among them. It will hold, she said, as long as someone is willing to stand up and say no. Across the galaxy, on worlds that had lived under the Council's shadow for generations, the story of humanity's defiance spread like fire. On a dozen planets, species that had bent under the weight of authority for centuries began, slowly and carefully, to straighten their backs. The galaxy was not yet free, but for the first time,